The dust of the meeting hall floor felt older than the town itself, each grain a silent witness to pronouncements of progress and prosperity. Obadiah stood in the center of the room, his stillness a stark contrast to the agitated shifting of the men who lined the benches. His hands, thick with the memory of rock and soil, were clasped loosely before him, not in supplication, but in a gesture of finality. He had already said his piece, spoken of the signs he knew as intimately as his own pulse, the unnatural migration of the high country fauna, the peculiar brittleness of the late summer grasses, the silent, deep-seated chill that the sun could no longer touch. He had told them of the long winter, the kind that doesn't just visit, but occupies, the kind that buries the world and scours it clean. Mayor Albright, a man whose ambition had outpaced his wisdom, stood to address the assembly, his voice a smooth, placating balm intended to soothe the anxieties Obadiah had stirred. Friends, we are pioneers. We face hardship with grit, not with ghost stories. We've had hard winters before, and we will again. But this talk of a white darkness, of a blizzard that lasts for months, it is fear-mongering. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Marcus Thorne, a rancher whose wealth was measured in cattle and arrogance, laughed aloud, a sharp, dismissive sound. He's a dirt scrabbler, not a prophet. He reads too much into squirrel nests and rabbit tracks. My herds are fine, the river is high. We'll have snow, same as always. Let him dig his hole if it brings him peace, but don't let his panic poison our town spirit. The verdict was passed not by a gavel, but by a collective turning of shoulders, a hardening of eyes. Obadiah had not offered them a choice, but a truth, and for that, he was an inconvenience. Albright delivered the final, quiet judgment. We appreciate your concern, Obadiah. But your perspective is unsettling the community. It would be best if you kept to your own affairs, away from town, until this delusion passes. It was an exile delivered with a polite smile. Obadiah looked from face to face, seeing not malice, but a fragile, stubborn pride. He gave a single, slow nod. There was nothing more to say. He turned and walked out, the silence he left behind more damning than any argument. His departure from the edge of town was unceremonious, marked only by the quiet crunch of his boots on the parched ground and the steady, reassuring presence of his old dog, Patch, trotting faithfully at his heel. He owned little that could not be carried, his life stripped down to necessities by seasons of solitude and loss. He carried a spade, a pickaxe, and a heavy canvas sack with the few tools and supplies that mattered. He did not look back. The town of Prosperity's hope, with its false frontages and its deeper, more dangerous facades, shrank behind him until it was just a smudge against the vast, indifferent landscape. He was heading for the Granite Shelf, a long-forgotten quarry site miles from town that the prospectors had abandoned decades prior. It was a place others saw as worthless, a scar on the land. Obadiah saw it as a foundation. He knew this land, not as a commodity to be conquered, but as a living thing with a vast and unforgiving memory. Years ago, in a different territory, he had seen a winter like the one he felt coming. He'd been a younger man then, part of a trapping party that had ignored the warnings of the native tribes. They had laughed then, too. He alone had survived, crawling from the wreckage of their overconfidence with a wisdom seared into his bones. He would not make that mistake again. He felt the air shift, a subtle thinning that spoke of altitude and the coming cold. Patch seemed to feel it too, pressing closer to his leg. Obadiah stopped and placed a hand on the dog's head, his gaze sweeping across the horizon. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue, a perfect deception. But the quality of the light was wrong, thin, and brittle, as if the sun itself were holding its breath. He was not guided by fear, but by a grim, unshakable certainty. The townspeople saw a doomsayer, a madman retreating into the earth. He knew he was simply a man who had learned to listen, and was now preparing for the long, deafening silence that was to come. He was not building a grave, he was building an ark of stone and soil. By the end of August, the entrance was a dark moor carved into the side of the granite hill, a testament to the relentless rhythm of pick, shovel, and sweat. Obadiah worked from before dawn until the last light failed, a solitary figure moving with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who understands that nature cannot be rushed, only prepared for. The initial tunnel ran 30 feet straight into the rock face before he began to hollow out the main chamber, following a softer vein of soapstone he had identified long ago. The work was brutal, a grueling conversation with geology. Each swing of the pick was a question, each bucket of rock hauled out was an answer. His hands, already calloused, became like worn leather, cracked and stained with the earth's minerals. He ate little, slept less, his body fueled by a singular, burning purpose. He was not merely digging, he was sculpting a space for life. He engineered a clever, hidden chimney flue that snaked up through a deep fissure in the granite, a design that would allow him to have a fire without a visible plume of smoke that might betray his location or be choked by the snow. He dug a deep well in a corner of the chamber, tapping into a slow, clear seep of groundwater that would provide a constant source of clean water. He built stone shelves into the walls, lining them with the dried meats, preserved vegetables, and bags of grain he had quietly amassed over the past year, trading furs and odd jobs for supplies the townsfolk thought were for his usual wintering over. As September faded, he began the final, most crucial task, a series of heavy inner doors made of reinforced timber and packed earth, designed to create airlocks that would trap warmth and keep the suffocating press of the snow at bay. The town, when he was briefly mentioned in the general store, was a subject of pity and mild amusement. They saw an old man's folly, a descent into madness. They could not comprehend the intricate, life-sustaining system taking shape beneath the ground, a hidden world of warmth and forethought, an answer to a question they hadn't yet learned to ask. The first snows arrived in early October, a delicate dusting that was gone by noon. The people of Prosperity's Hope saw it as a prelude to a crisp, beautiful autumn. Obadiah saw it as a polite warning. He noted how the snow didn't melt from the northern faces of the rocks, a sign that the ground itself was already frozen deeper than it should be. He sealed his outermost door, leaving only a smaller, heavily insulated entrance he could pass through to make final observations. Inside, his refuge was a small pocket of defiant warmth. A fire burned low and steady in the stone hearth, its light dancing across the neatly stacked shelves and the simple cot where he rested his weary bones. Patch lay curled on a worn blanket, thumping his tail in contentment, oblivious to the world outside. Back in town, the chatter was of the upcoming harvest dance and the handsome profits from the summer's cattle drives. Marcus Thorne stood in the saloon, holding a glass of whiskey, his voice booming with confidence. Heard from a traveler that Obadiah sealed himself in his gopher hole. Probably thinks this little flurry is the beginning of the end. The old fool will suffocate on his own fear before the first real storm. The men around him laughed, their confidence buoyed by the warmth of the stove and the liquor in their bellies. They saw the strengthening winds as a minor nuisance, the dropping temperatures as an invigorating sign of the season. They added another log to their fires, patched a few drafts in their walls, and believed they were prepared. Obadiah, miles away and deep underground, felt the temperature shift through the stone itself. He ran his hand along the rock wall, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration humming through it. It was the sound of the deep earth responding to the immense pressure of the cold air descending from the north. It was a sound he remembered. It was the sound of the world holding its breath, just before the scream. He checked the seal on the inner door one last time, gave Patch a reassuring pat, and added a single, perfectly seasoned log to his fire. He was ready. His work was done. Now, all that was left was to wait and to listen. The storm did not arrive, it fell. It was as if the sky, a vast grey sheet of iron, simply cracked and let the entire weight of the Arctic fall upon the world. One moment, there was a biting wind and heavy snow, the next, there was no wind, no snow, only a single, solid, vertical wall of white that erased the world. The temperature plummeted with a speed that felt like a physical blow, turning the air to frozen glass. In Prosperity's Hope, the initial mood of cozy defiance shattered in a matter of hours. The laughter in the saloon died first, replaced by uneasy silence as the windows began to groan under the strain. Homes that had felt sturdy and secure became fragile traps. The wind, which had been a gale, became a geological force, a relentless, shrieking pressure that forced snow through every crack, every keyhole, every floorboard. The sound was a constant, mind-breaking howl that seemed to come from inside the skull. The town's meager preparations were a joke. stockpiled wood became inaccessible under 15-foot drifts that appeared in the first night. Livestock, caught in their pens, were buried alive, their panicked cries swallowed by the storm's roar. The cold was a predator. It was not merely an absence of heat, but an active, invasive presence that leached the warmth from every living thing. Inside Obadiah's shelter, there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the quiet sound of his own breathing. The deep stone walls absorbed the storm's fury, turning its apocalyptic symphony into a distant, muffled hum. He sat on his cot, mending a piece of leather, the picture of calm in the heart of the maelstrom. He knew what was happening above. He could picture it with grim clarity, the fires dying, the food running low, the hopeful bravado curdling into the acid of terror. He felt no satisfaction, no vindication. He felt only a deep, profound sorrow for a people who had been offered a warning and had chosen to listen to the empty reassurances of their own pride instead. The world he had prepared for had arrived. And they were just beginning to understand that their world was already gone. Weeks bled into a month, and the storm never broke. It became the only reality, a new state of being. The howling of the wind was the world's only song, a dirge for a town that was slowly starving in the dark. Inside the homes of prosperity's hope was the first thing to freeze. The initial unity of shared disaster fractured into the sharp-edged reality of individual survival. Families huddled in single rooms, burning their furniture for a few precious hours of warmth, the smoke stinging their eyes in the poorly ventilated spaces. Food, which had been communal for the first week, was now hoarded, counted, and fought over in desperate, whispered arguments. Mayor Albright's authority crumbled into dust. His speeches about resilience and community spirit were meaningless against the gnawing emptiness of a child's stomach or the creeping blackness of frostbite on a husband's fingers. Marcus Thorne, the rancher whose wealth was now a frozen, invisible asset buried under 30 feet of snow, was even more useless. His arrogance had been a shield of bluster, and with nothing to bluster about, he shrank into a bitter, resentful man who saw every request for help as a personal slight. Sickness came next, a quiet, creeping cough that settled deep in the lungs, flourishing in the cold, damp, and crowded conditions. The town doctor, a man more accustomed to setting bones and treating fevers, was helpless against the profound, systemic collapse of the human body under such extreme duress. People began to die. It happened quietly, without ceremony. They simply lay down under their thin blankets and did not wake up. The living were too weak and the cold too absolute to even consider digging graves. The dead remained, silent monuments to a collective, fatal miscalculation. It was in this suffocating silence, broken only by the storm and the coughing, that the town's memory finally, painfully, turned to the old man they had cast out. His name, Obadiah, was first spoken as a curse, then as a question, and finally, as a desperate, impossible prayer. The decision was made in the ruins of the general store, the last place with a passable roof. A small group of the town's remaining able-bodied men gathered, their faces skeletal in the light of a single tallow lamp. Albright was there, a diminished figure wrapped in a threadbare blanket. Thorne was conspicuously absent, barricaded in his own home, protecting his dwindling personal stores. It was Samuel, a young farmer who had lost his small herd and was now watching his wife fade, who finally gave voice to the unthinkable. He knew, Samuel said, his own voice raspy. Obadiah knew this was coming. He tried to tell us. An older man, a blacksmith named Henry, shook his head, his breath a white plume in the frigid air. He's long dead, son. No man could survive this out in the open. He wasn't in the open, Samuel insisted, a flicker of something other than despair in his eyes. He was digging. All summer, he was digging into that old granite shelf. What if he wasn't mad? What if he was right? It was a seed of impossible hope planted in frozen ground. The mission was suicide, they all knew it. The quarry was miles away, and no one even knew for certain if they could find it in the white, featureless hellscape the world had become. But the alternative was to stay and slowly die. Samuel volunteered. He was younger, stronger than the rest, and more than anything, he was haunted by the memory of his own silence in the meeting hall that day. He had stood with the mockers, and now his wife was paying the price. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he possessed, took a small, frozen piece of jerky, and tied a rope around his waist, the other end held by the men. It was a gesture of faith more than a practical safety measure. He stepped out of the store into the shrieking chaos of the blizzard. The force of the snow and wind was like a solid wall, instantly blinding him. The cold was a physical pain that stole his breath. He was not navigating by sight, but by a remembered geography, a desperate prayer that his feet would know the way his eyes could not. Samuel's journey was a descent into a frozen purgatory. He measured his progress in breaths, each one a painful, searing intake of ice-filled air. The world was a churning vortex of white, a place of complete sensory deprivation where the only constants were the crushing cold and the deafening roar of the wind. He fell countless times, the rope his only connection to the world of the living, a faint, reassuring tug from the men who stood at the edge of town, feeding it out into the void. He lost all sense of time, his mind narrowing to a single, repetitive thought, one more step. He thought of his wife's shallow breathing, of the hollow look in her eyes, and he found the strength for the next step, and the next. He nearly missed it. A subtle shift in the terrain under his feet, a slight rise where there should have been none, was the only clue. He clawed at the snow with his frozen hands, his fingers numb and useless. He dug like a dying animal, driven by a primal instinct. His hand struck something hard, something that was not rock. It was wood. He fumbled in the darkness of the snowdrift, his mind barely registering what he had found. It was the top of a door frame. Hope, fierce and painful, surged through him, giving him a last burst of adrenaline. He screamed, his voice a pathetic croak instantly ripped away by the wind, and hammered on the wooden surface with his fist. He felt his consciousness failing, the warmth of his blood turning to slush in his veins. The world began to go dark, the roar of the wind fading to a distant hum. And then, a sound. A scraping, grinding noise from beneath him. A section of the wood moved, and a rectangle of faint, warm, yellow light appeared in the snow. A figure stood in the opening, silhouetted against the glow. Obadiah looked down at the half-dead man collapsed on his doorstep, his face calm, his eyes missing nothing. He knelt, his expression unreadable. "You are a long way from home," Obadiah said, his voice even, without surprise or triumph. He and Patch, the old dog whining softly at the sight of the stranger, carefully dragged Samuel's limp body out of the storm and into the warmth of the earth. Inside the shelter, the sudden warmth and silence were a shock to Samuel's system. He lay on a cot, wrapped in thick wool blankets, shivering uncontrollably as the life crept painfully back into his frozen limbs. He took in the scene with wide, disbelieving eyes. It was a cave, yes, but it was also a home. A fire burned cleanly in a stone hearth, casting a warm, steady glow on walls lined with shelves. The shelves were laden with provisions, neatly organized and plentiful. The air was dry and smelled of wood smoke and baked bread. A pot of stew simmered over the fire, and the sight and smell of it made him weep. Obadiah said nothing, simply handing him a mug of hot, clear broth. The warmth spread through Samuel's chest, a feeling so foreign and so welcome that it felt like a resurrection. When he could finally speak, his voice was a hoarse whisper. He told Obadiah everything. He spoke of the storm, the cold, the sickness, the dying. He spoke of the town's arrogance and their terrible, fatal error. He confessed his own shame, the guilt he felt for being one of the crowd, for laughing at the man who was now saving his life. He finished his story, his gaze fixed on the stone floor, expecting judgment, or at the very least, a bitter "I told you so." Obadiah sat on a stool across from him, sharpening a small knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape the only sound for a long time. Finally, he stopped. He looked at Samuel, his eyes clear and direct. "Pride is a luxury. It doesn't keep you warm or fill your belly. You came here because you have nothing left. Your town is a tomb because your leaders chose pride over wisdom." Samuel nodded, unable to speak. "I can help," Obadiah said, and Samuel's heart leaped. "But not out of pity. Pity is another luxury. I will help because living is better than dying. But my help has a price. It is not paid in gold or promises. It is paid in obedience." He set the knife and stone aside. "You will go back. You will bring them here, the ones who can walk. You will tell them that this place is not a charity. It is a refuge, and it has rules. My rules. There are no mayors here. There are no ranchers. There are only workers. Everyone carries their weight. Everyone follows my orders without question. Those who will not work will not eat. Those who will not obey will be sent back into the storm. That is the only law here. Do you understand? Samuel looked at the old man, seeing not a hermit or a prophet, but a leader forged in the crucible of absolute necessity. He saw the cold, hard logic of survival, and he knew it was their only chance. They will understand, Samuel said, his voice firm for the first time. Or they will die. The rescue was a brutal, systematic undertaking. Obadiah, with Samuel now acting as his proxy, orchestrated it with the dispassionate precision of a general. They would not risk everyone at once. Using a long, heavy rope Obadiah had woven from braided hides, Samuel led small groups of 5 from the dying town to the living shelter. Each trip was a gamble against the storm, a harrowing journey that left the rescued townsfolk collapsed at the entrance, weeping with a mixture of relief and disbelief as they were brought into the impossible warmth. The first to arrive were the families, the people whose only sin had been to trust their leaders. They huddled in the main chamber, their eyes wide with the shock of salvation, their gratitude so profound it was silent. Then came the others, the men who had stood in the meeting hall, their faces now gaunt with hunger and etched with a deep, corrosive shame. They avoided Obadiah's gaze, unable to meet the eyes of the man they had condemned. True to his word, Obadiah put them all to work. There was no status in his subterranean world. Mayor Albright, his voice now a thin, reedy thing, was put in charge of portioning out the water, a task that required a steady hand and meticulous care. Others were tasked with sorting supplies, mending clothes, or tending to the sick, who were quarantined in a smaller, secondary chamber Obadiah had carved for that very purpose. Marcus Thorne was among the last to be brought over, dragged from his home where he had been found delirious, huddled over the last of his private food stores. When he was well enough to stand, Obadiah handed him 2 buckets. "The latrine is at the end of the western tunnel," he said, his voice flat, devoid of malice or triumph. "It needs to be emptied twice a day." Thorne stared, his face a mask of incredulous fury. For a moment, it seemed the old arrogance would flare up. But then he looked around the chamber, at the faces of the people he had led so confidently into ruin, and he saw the utter irrelevance of his former power. He took the buckets and walked away without a word. Obadiah was not just saving their lives, he was stripping them down to their essential selves and teaching them the fundamental grammar of survival. He taught them how to bank the fire to conserve fuel, how to properly salt and preserve the meat from the few animals they managed to salvage, how to listen to the sounds of the rock for signs of the storm's shifting intensity. He was not a kind teacher, but he was a thorough one. He was saving them not by offering comfort, but by demanding competence.